She walked into a church on the holiest night of the Catholic year, wearing a white dress, carrying nothing but her faith, and she never walked back out. The man who killed her was known. The prosecutor knew his name. The church knew his name. The reporters knew his name. And for 57 years, every single one of them stayed silent, while a grieving family buried their daughter and waited for justice that never came. What you are about to hear is not just a murder story. It is a story about how power protects itself, how institutions bury the truth, and how one family refused, for more than half a century, to let the world forget the name IRENE Garza. Before we go any further, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now and tap the notification bell so you never miss a case on Cold Case Reopened. Drop a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from. We read every single one. And if this story moves you, share it, because the only way cases like this stay alive is if people like you refuse to let them die. Now let's get into it. McAllen, Texas, 1960. A border city in southern Hidalgo County, sitting fewer than 5 miles from the Rio Grande River. More than 80% of its population was Spanish-speaking, of Mexican descent, and deeply, sincerely Catholic. Not Catholic the way people describe themselves on a form, Catholic the way people breathe. The church was not just a building people visited on Sundays. It was the backbone of the entire community, the social structure, the moral compass. And the priest standing at the front of that church was not just a religious figure. He was God's representative on earth. His word was not questioned. His collar was not scrutinized. In McAllen in 1960, absolute trust was given the moment a man put on that collar. No questions asked, no history required. IRENE Garza had grown up in that faith, and she lived it every single day of her 25 years on this earth. She taught second grade at Thigpen Elementary School, and her students never forgot her. Not because she was remarkable in some grand, public way, but because she would kneel down to their eye level every time one of them spoke to her. She looked them in the eye. She listened. In 1958, she had been crowned Miss All South Texas Sweetheart. Her neighbors remembered her gentle voice. Her friends remembered her open heart and her generosity of spirit. She was the kind of woman an entire community builds itself around without fully realizing it, until she is gone. Easter was the most sacred night of the Catholic year. The night Christ rose. Confessing before Easter was not optional for a woman like IRENE. It was a duty she took seriously. A way of standing clean before God on the most important night of the year. On the evening of April the 16th, 1960, Holy Saturday, IRENE put on a white dress, picked up her purse, and drove to Sacred Heart Church to make her confession. She was never seen alive again. Now here is what you need to understand about the man who was waiting for her inside that church. Father John Fite was 27 years old. Born in Chicago. He was an intern in pastoral ministry at Sacred Heart, a newcomer, a stranger, someone the community had not yet had time to know. But he wore the collar. And in McAllen in 1960, that was all anyone needed to see. What the community did not yet know, and what the Catholic Church already knew, was that just 3 weeks before IRENE walked into Sacred Heart, Fite had attacked another woman. Her name was Maria Garza. She had been kneeling at the communion rail at Immaculate Conception Church in Edinburgh, the city right next door, when a man matching Fite's description grabbed her from behind and tried to cover her mouth. Fite was tried for that attack in 1961. He pleaded guilty to aggravated assault. And his punishment, the full weight of the American justice system brought to bear on a man who had physically attacked a woman inside a church, was a $500 fine. No prison. No removal from the priesthood. No restriction on his ability to sit alone in a closed room with women who trusted him with their deepest confessions. The system had a documented, concrete, undeniable opportunity to stop John Fite 3 weeks before IRENE Garza walked through those church doors. The system did not take it. On Holy Saturday evening, the priest who had been scheduled to hear confessions was Father O'Brien, the resident assistant pastor. Fite volunteered to take his place. No one questioned it. He then pulled IRENE away from the regular confessional entirely, away from the open space, away from other people, and asked her to confess privately at the rectory. It was unusual, but he wore the collar, and so IRENE followed him. Inside that rectory, John Fite attacked IRENE Garza. He sexually assaulted her while she was unconscious, and he suffocated her with a cellophane bag in the bathtub. When IRENE had not come home by 3 o'clock in the morning on Easter Sunday, her parents drove to the McAllen Police Department and reported her missing. What followed was the largest search in the history of the Rio Grande Valley. Authorities mobilized 70 members of the Hidalgo County Sheriff's Posse. 65 National Guardsmen were deployed. Divers dragged the irrigation canals. 2 Border Patrol planes swept the area from the sky. Police went door to door across a 32-block radius surrounding Sacred Heart Church. More than 500 people were interviewed. Her car was still parked near the church. She had not driven away. She had never left. Scattered along nearby roads and fields, searchers found pieces of her patent leather purse lying in a field, one high-heeled shoe on a quiet road, her lace veil abandoned in the dirt. Each item, a breadcrumb leading nowhere good. Each item, a fresh wound for her family. False leads came in waves, and each one was its own kind of cruelty. A woman called claiming to be Irene, saying she had been kidnapped and was being held at a nearby hotel. The call was fake. A drunk man in Edinburgh told a waitress he had killed her. He had not. Every false lead was another surge of desperate hope followed by another collapse, and the family lived through each one in real time. Irene's father, Milo Garza, did not sleep for 5 days. He knocked on every door he could find. He walked the canal banks. He moved through the orange groves and the mesquite brush in the dark, calling his daughter's name into the silence. 5 days of that. 5 days without sleep and without answers. On April the 21st, 1960, 5 days after Irene had disappeared, her body was found face down in an irrigation canal near Business 83 and 2nd Street in McAllen. Not in some remote location. Not hidden in the wilderness. A shallow canal in the middle of the city that people walked and drove past every single day. The autopsy confirmed she had been sexually assaulted while unconscious and killed by suffocation with a cellophane bag. When police arrived at the Garza home to deliver the news, Milo Garza collapsed on the spot. The man who had not slept in 5 days, who had knocked on hundreds of doors, who had called his daughter's name into the darkness every night. He collapsed when he finally got the answer. Irene's mother could not stand. The community gathered outside Sacred Heart Church and wept in the street. From the very first days, the evidence pointed directly and unmistakably at one man. At the irrigation canal where Irene's body was found, police recovered an Eastman Kodak slide projector. Not something a random McAllen resident would own. Not something that would end up in a drainage canal by accident. Handwriting on the device confirmed it belonged to Father John Fite. On Easter night, when the priests at Sacred Heart gathered for coffee after midnight mass, Father O'Brien looked at Fite's hand and saw a fresh scratch. Not a bruise. Not a cut. A scratch. The kind left by a person fighting back against someone attacking them. When O'Brien asked about it, Fite said he had locked himself out of his room and climbed to the 2nd floor to get back in, scratching his hand in the process and breaking his glasses. O'Brien heard that explanation and did not believe a word of it. He was so suspicious that on Easter Sunday morning, before Irene's disappearance had even been officially reported to the police, O'Brien and another priest quietly searched the attic and basement of Sacred Heart Church themselves. They suspected their colleague. They found nothing because by then, Irene was already gone. O'Brien later got in his car and followed Fite through the city streets. He lost him at a red light. A student who sat beside Fite in class at the University of Texas in Edinburgh shortly after Easter also noticed the scratch on his hand. He described it, clearly and without hesitation, as a fingernail mark. When police formally questioned Fite, his account of that evening kept changing. First he said he had not heard Irene's confession at all, and that another priest had been present. Then he changed his statement and admitted he had heard her confession, alone. He was asked to submit to a polygraph test. He failed. The slide projector found at the scene. The scratch on his hand. The contradictory statements to police. The failed polygraph. For separate pieces of evidence, all pointing at the same man. And still, no arrest was made. Instead, the Catholic Church moved quietly and decisively. Church superiors ordered Fite removed from McAllen. Not to face the police. Not to answer for what the evidence suggested. Removed and sent to a Trappist monastery in Missouri, placing him completely beyond the reach of the ongoing investigation. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment right now that says, "I'm still here." Let's see who is truly following this story, because what comes next is the part that should make every single one of us furious. In 1962, Hidalgo County District Attorney Lloyd Lattimore called a group of 6 to 8 local reporters into his office on the 3rd floor of the county courthouse for a closed-door meeting. No recordings. No reporting. No broadcasting. What was said in that room stayed in that room. Or so he expected. Decades later, television reporter Daryl Davis took the stand at the 2017 trial and testified, under oath, about exactly what Lattimore said to that room full of journalists. His words, as Davis recounted them, were these: "We know that Father Fite killed IRENE Garza, and the church knows that he killed IRENE Garza. So we have made some arrangements. The arrangement was this. Fite would plead guilty to the earlier assault on the other woman, the attack that had earned him that $500 fine, and in exchange, the authorities would not prosecute him for the murder of IRENE Garza. The Catholic Church, in turn, promised that Fite would be sent to a monastery for disturbed priests and confined there for the rest of his life. Every reporter in that room heard it. Every reporter in that room agreed to keep it quiet." Davis later said, "For some reason, everyone said okay and accepted it. A different era. The court knew. The church knew. The press knew. Everyone looked the other way. And then the church broke its promise. In 1972, John Fite walked out of that monastery. He moved to Scottsdale, Arizona. He got married. He had 3 children. He built a quiet, ordinary suburban life and lived it for decades, free, unprosecuted, untouched, as though that holy Saturday night had never happened. Meanwhile, Milo Garza aged in McAllen carrying a wound that never healed. He never got an answer in his lifetime. He died still carrying it. Irene's mother died without justice too. But there was one person who did not let the torch go out. Naomi Sigler was Irene's cousin. When the generation above her aged and passed, Naomi took the fight onto her own shoulders. She knocked on police doors. She knocked on prosecutor doors. She wrote letters. She showed up to meetings. She demanded the case be treated as what it was, a solvable murder with a known suspect, and she refused to accept insufficient evidence as an answer because she knew the evidence existed. She knew that people knew, and she knew that the reason this case had not been prosecuted was not a lack of proof. It was a deliberate, protected silence. Then in 2002, 42 years after IRENE Garza was pulled from that irrigation canal, Texas Ranger Rudy Jaramillo received a phone call. The caller was Dale Tacheny, a former Trappist monk who had lived at the very Missouri monastery where the Catholic Church had sent John Fite in 1960. Tacheny told Jaramillo that in 1963, 3 years after Irene's murder, during counseling sessions at the monastery, Fite had described in specific detail what he had done. He talked about pulling a young woman into the rectory. He described the assault. He described the cellophane bag. He described the bathtub. And throughout that entire conversation, Tacheny said, Fite had shown not a single sign of remorse. Not grief. Not guilt. Nothing. He did not show what I would call repentance, grief, or anything like that. Tacheny testified. I felt quite horrified. Tacheny had stayed silent for 40 years because he told himself it was not his place to judge. But by 2002, he was old, and he could no longer carry the weight of what he knew. He made the call. Jaramillo then tracked down Father O'Brien, the assistant pastor who had seen that scratch on Fite's hand on Easter night 1960. O'Brien was now elderly, living in a priest's retirement home in San Antonio. He confirmed to Jaramillo that Fite had confessed to him directly after the murder, and that he had known from the moment he saw those scratches exactly what they meant. 2 independent witnesses. 2 separate confessions from Fite, one given to O'Brien within days of the crime, one given to Tacheny 3 years later in a monastery in Missouri. The case was reopened after 42 years. Naomi Sigler, who had spent decades fighting for exactly this moment, finally felt that answers were coming. They were not. Not yet. Hidalgo County District Attorney Rene Guerra had held his position for over 30 years. When the Texas Rangers brought him the reopened case in 2002, 2 witnesses, 2 confessions from the suspect himself, Guerra refused to prosecute. He called Tacheny unreliable, suggesting the former monk had a personal agenda. He questioned Father O'Brien's mental state. For 2 years, from 2002 to 2004, he refused to bring the case before a grand jury. It was only when sustained pressure from the Garza family forced his hand that he finally did so. On June 9, 2004, a grand jury heard the case. But Fite was never called to testify. Tacheny was never called. Father O'Brien was never called. The Texas Rangers were brought in only near the very end of the session, when most of the available time had already been used up. The grand jury returned no indictment. Father O'Brien died in 2005, at the age of 77, having never stood before a jury and told what he knew. In the courthouse hallway after that session, Garza walked up to Naomi Sigler and said it directly to her face. "You will never get an indictment in this case." Naomi stood in that hallway and received those words. She understood what they meant. It was not a statement about evidence. It was not a statement about law. It was a declaration of will from a man who had decided, for reasons she could only guess at, that this case would not move forward as long as he held the power to stop it. She did not stop. In March of 2014, CBS's 48 Hours aired an episode called The Last Confession, bringing the IRENE Garza case to a national television audience for the first time in decades. Reporter Richard Schlesinger traveled to Scottsdale, walked up to John Fite's front door, and confronted the man face to face. Fite, by then over 80 years old, silver-haired, standing in the doorway of his quiet Arizona home, looked directly into the camera and said, "I did not kill IRENE Garza. I don't know who did." The whole country watched. That same year, the Hidalgo County District Attorney election became something no one in the community could ignore. It was not about budgets or policy platforms. It was about a single name. Ricardo Rodriguez, a 41-year-old former district judge, challenged Garza, who was running for his 9th consecutive term in office. Rodriguez made one central promise to the voters of Hidalgo County. If elected, he would reopen the IRENE Garza case. In March of 2014, Rodriguez won with 64% of the vote, one of the most decisive upsets in the history of that office. Garza was gone. In January of 2015, Rodriguez took office and immediately directed his team to review the entire case from the beginning. More than a year of quiet, careful work followed, examining every piece of evidence, tracking down every surviving witness, and learning everything that the 2004 grand jury had deliberately not been shown. In early February of 2016, Rodriguez presented the full case to a new grand jury. This time, with everything. With all the witnesses. With all the evidence. With nothing withheld and no one left out. The grand jury returned a true bill. An official indictment was issued. On February the 9th, 2016, 56 years after Holy Saturday 1960, the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office, working alongside McAllen Police and the Texas Rangers, executed the arrest warrant in Scottsdale, Arizona. John Fite, 83 years old, was handcuffed outside the home where he had lived his quiet, comfortable, unprosecuted life for decades. He was extradited to Texas. For the first time in more than half a century, John Fite set foot in McAllen, the city where he had killed IRENE Garza, and from which the Catholic Church had quietly spirited him away before anyone could stop them. Naomi Sigler was in the courtroom when he was let in. The trial began in November of 2017 at the Hidalgo County Courthouse in Edinburgh. 57 years between the crime and the courtroom. Among the longest gaps between a murder and its trial in the history of the United States. Fite, now 84 years old, sat at the defense table while his lawyers argued there was no physical evidence directly connecting him to IRENE Garza's death. On the other side of the room sat Naomi Sigler and what remained of the Garza family. People who had waited 57 years for this exact moment. People who had been told, by the very officials sworn to serve them, that this day would never come. The central witness was Dale Tacheny, now 88 years old. He walked to the stand with trembling hands and the measured, careful voice of a man near 90 carrying a burden he had held for more than 4 decades. When the prosecutor asked him whether he knew IRENE Garza, Tacheny shook his head slowly and said, quietly, "No, but I knew she had parents." He paused. Then he said, "Can we move on to something else?" And then he told the jury everything. Everything Fite had described to him in that Missouri monastery in 1963. The rectory, the assault, the cellophane bag, the bathtub, the complete absence of remorse. The prosecution also placed before the jury the letters exchanged between Catholic Church clergy in 1960, discussing how to handle Fite after IRENE's body was found. Letters about sending him to the monastery instead of surrendering him to the police. Letters that revealed, in the church's own handwriting, a coordinated decision to conceal what had happened and protect one of their own. The prosecution called those letters the smoking gun of a deliberate, organized institutional cover-up. The Garza family was present every single day of the 7-day trial. On December the 7th, 2017, after 6.5 hours of deliberation, The jury walked back into that courtroom with a verdict. John Fight was convicted of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. Naomi Sigler sat in that courtroom and listened as the sentence was read aloud. 57 years of knocking on doors that would not open. 57 years of being handed back the word insufficient. 57 years of a prosecutor's voice in a courthouse hallway saying, "You will never get an indictment in this case." All of it, every single year of it, ending in that room on that day. John Fight died in prison on February the 12th, 2020, at the age of 87, from heart disease compounded by stage 3 bladder and kidney cancer. He did not die in the quiet house in Scottsdale, Arizona, where he had lived freely for so long. He died in prison, and however many years he served, that is where he spent the last chapter of his life. That is the price he paid. After the verdict, Naomi Sigler stood before the press and said, "Irene can finally rest in peace. 57 years is far too long a time to wait. But that is the time the Garza family fought for, and no one can take that away from them. There are things this case demands we remember, not as footnotes, but as facts we carry forward. When someone in a position of authority, a priest, a doctor, a coach, a teacher, is accused of assault and the system responds with a fine and a handshake and a promise to do better, that is not the end of the story. It is a warning. John Fight attacked a woman at the communion rail 3 weeks before he killed Irene Garza. He was handed a $500 fine and sent back into ministry. If that first crime had been treated with the seriousness it deserved, Irene Garza would have lived. Religious institutions are human institutions. They are built by people and they protect people, but sometimes the people they choose to protect are the ones inside the walls rather than the ones outside them. When an institution conceals a violent crime to preserve its reputation, that is not a spiritual failing. It is criminal conduct, and it can be prosecuted. Your local district attorney election is one of the most consequential votes you will ever cast, and most people never pay attention to it. IRENE GARZA held that office for over 30 years and refused to prosecute a known killer for the entirety of that time. The man who replaced him convicted John Fight within 2 years of taking office. That is the difference one election made. Research the DA candidates in your area. Understand how they handle cold cases and sexual assault cases before you vote, because the difference is not abstract. It is the difference between justice and a courthouse hallway and the words, "You will never get an indictment in this case." And if you are carrying something, if you know something about an unsolved crime and you have been telling yourself it is not your place, that too much time has passed, that it would not matter now, look at Dale Tacheny. He carried his secret for 40 years. One phone call in 2002 reopened a case that had been closed for 4 decades. One phone call is what it took to bring John Fight to justice. The cost of silence is real, and so is the power of finally deciding to speak. If this story stayed with you, if Irene Garza's name means something to you now, then do something with that. Like this video so more people can find it. Subscribe to Cold Case Reopened so you never miss a story that deserves to be told. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, because the only way a case like this stays alive is if people refuse to let it be forgotten. Leave a comment below. Tell us what part of this story hit you hardest. We read every single word you write. Irene Garza waited 57 years for justice. The very least we can do is make sure the world keeps saying her name. We will see you in the next one.